Okay, so first of all, apologies. I guess I forgot completely that the new quarter doesn't start on the first service of the new quarter. It starts on the first Sunday. So we could have actually spent an extra week on our previous book, which was talking about how we got the Bible. However, I think it'll work out pretty well because the books are running a little bit late. They'll be here tomorrow. But I did email out copies of chapter 1 and chapter 2. And I was planning on printing them out, but then after looking at it, they were 9 pages each. And to print out, I mean, even just 20 or 30 copies, that's a lot of printing, especially for just 1 or 2 weeks. So I emailed them out, just show of hands, was anybody able to take a look at those? Okay, there were a couple. For future thought process, okay, if you like having it on your tablet, a phone, on the computer, whatever, CEI and places we order these books from, they offer just a blanket $100 fee for class usage of a PDF. And then we can just order on a case-by-case basis if people want actual physical books. And that might actually end up saving money if we wanted to do that, if you're comfortable. If not, then that's fine too. We just continue doing what we're doing. But we are starting this evening with Unraveling Evolution by Joshua Gertner. And so what we're going to do, because we don't have the books yet, okay, we're going to go through, I've highlighted some of chapter 1 that I want to focus on, especially for those of you who haven't read it, those of you who may be visiting. So we're going to go through chapter 1. As I said, chapter 1 and chapter 2, they are topics that we've discussed quite a bit over the last, several months, at least from a cursory perspective. Joshua goes at this from a more scientific perspective. And those of you who've actually read it already, Joshua walks a real fine line between using academic language, but then he goes and defines what that means. Okay, some of these terms, if he didn't have it in there, we may not understand some of these terms. But Joshua is a very highly educated individual. As I mentioned, I actually know Josh, first of all, when I was preaching at airport congregation in South Carolina, in Columbia, we had his brother and wife as members there, which is how we ended up having Joshua for a gospel meeting. Jared and his wife were members at the airport. And Josh, when he came, he preached a gospel meeting, and this was back in 08, 09, but he preached a gospel meeting on this very thing, on the idea of evolution from a scientific or academic perspective. And I wanted to point a couple of these things out. He goes into this talking about that a lot of the chapters presuppose a belief in God. And the first 2 chapters are included, first of all, to kind of broach the subject for somebody who doesn't believe in God, and also bolster the faith of those who maybe have doubts, or maybe who have wondered, well, why is this, why do people think that, or why do people argue this? And so that's part of the reason why Josh includes that. And the next thing I wanted to point out is the fact that, that he has a PhD in food microbiology. He has postdoctoral research he completed at the University of Georgia. He's lectured on food microbiology in US, Canada, South Korea, China. And then he also is a researcher, or was a research scientist at least, for the USDA. And so all of that kind of talk about that because he knows what he's talking about. Okay, this is not just something that somebody sat down and kind of put together, which is fine if you do the research, but he's well studied on this. So, starting, this is the page 7, this is lesson 1. The whole idea of this is, can we trust the Bible as the inspired word of God? And so he points out in this introduction, talking about the fact that if we're going to talk about this, we have to kind of have a common ground of believing in God. Because debating biblical morality with an atheist is akin to arguing calculus with an individual who denies that 1 + 1 = 2. There's no baseline, there's no commonality to be able to approach that. And so he looks at this from an interesting perspective, which is, what would the world be like if people didn't believe in God? What would the consequences of atheism be? And this goes to, there's the Humanist Manifesto, book 1 and 2. There's a lot of different books dealing with Humanist Manifesto. There's a lot of humanism in some of the movies that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. Perhaps the most blatant, well, I say blatant, perhaps most kind of under the radar book lately was The Martian. That actually had a lot of humanist elements to it that you don't catch the first time through if you're just into the story of, I forget what his name was, on Mars, just stuck on Mars. I keep on saying Ben Affleck, it's not Ben Affleck. But anyway, there's a lot of humanist elements to that. Huh? Matt Damon, thank you, Matt Damon. There's a lot of humanist elements to that movie. So he brings up to assume that there's no creator necessarily means there's no divine authority, which in turn means no higher standard. And when we talk about ethical, moral type of standards, what's right and what's wrong, it has to be all based on some sort of absolute understanding. So it has to come from somewhere. And that's part of what he's describing. If everyone believed in atheism, if everybody followed this train of thought, then there would be no real meaning to any kind of moral law at all. He mentions how the Humanist Manifesto brings up that ethics is autonomous and situational. That is, morality is dependent upon only one person's perception of right or wrong. I'm going to exit full screen so this. There we go. He says it's autonomous and situational. Now, remember a couple of weeks ago we talked in a lesson about situational ethics. And the whole premise of that, the whole bottom line of that is to kind of attempt to suggest that there can be no absolute truth. Either that or absolute truth can't be done. Okay, either way, it's a sense of doubt, the sense of, well, anything can go if that's the case. And situational ethics is perfectly within that perspective. He says that morality is dependent upon anyone's personal perception of right and wrong in any given situation. And so it's really interesting because he brings this up in connection with a lot of specific examples in history. He says the atheist cannot say it is wrong to commit murder, genocide, rape, abuse animals or the environment, torture or maim other human beings, or enslave people against their will. You won't hear an atheist argue that though. Okay? They would say that those are wrong. Why are they wrong? Okay. You could say that, and usually the answer to that, and Josh doesn't go into this, but usually the answer that they will provide to them why they're wrong is because those types of things don't lend themselves to a decent and ordered civilization or society. Okay? Okay, that's fair enough. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying it's wrong. Not that it's indecent or disorderly. Wrong has an entirely different connotation or carries with a different idea than just, it doesn't contribute to society. It doesn't contribute to something that, even if you say it's wrong because it doesn't contribute to society, that is assuming that there is a standard that we have to contribute to society in some way. Where does that standard come from? And so you end up in these kind of circular arguments when people don't really want to address kind of the elephant in the room with that. He brings up Nietzsche. A lot of people reference or quote Nietzsche. Sometimes they quote him in a bad way. Sometimes they quote him in an approving way. But he mentions the fact that morality is a hindrance to the development of new and better customs. It makes stupid. And Adolf Hitler was a well-known student of Nietzsche. And I think it's really interesting that Josh points out the fact that basically Adolf Hitler brought to its actual application everything that atheism really stands for and means. You know, what Adolf Hitler attempted to do was to establish his own standard of what the perfect, in that case German, was. Anyone who was undesirable or didn't fit that was killed. Okay, it wasn't just, he talks about undesirables, 10 million undesirables, and it wasn't just Jews that he killed. It was people that were considered to be kind of variant, or people who were blind, people who were sickly. I mean, it was like Sparta times 10. Is what really he kind of put into effect. The thought process that I have, though, is that if macroevolutionists believe in evolution the way that they do, and evolution teaches survival of the fittest, then there should be no way that they can claim what Adolf Hitler did was wrong. Because in essence, what Hitler did was to actually promote the whole idea of the Humanist Manifesto. He basically played it out within a country. He got rid of those who were considered to be unfit, and only the strongest would survive.
He was trying to accelerate it, though.
It was eugenics. Yeah, it was eugenics. He was trying to accelerate that genetic aspect, I understand. But there was still that component of, why would you allow someone that has blindness or someone who has some sort of immuno disorder, why would you allow their genetic DNA to remain in the population pool? Why would you allow that? You need to get rid of that so that you take that opportunity out for that to be passed on. That's the natural thought process of what, in theory, humanists and evolutionists should think. But in reality, they don't, at least they don't say that they think that. Because obviously, would that be almost universally condemned? Yes, absolutely it would. And as Josh points out, the conclusion of this would be, if this were all true, just as the Apostle Paul said, we are all in the most pitiable. And again, that's in context of 1 Corinthians 15, that means our faith would be in vain. And there's some other points, again, I highly recommend you go through and read the chapter if you haven't already, but there's really good points that he makes. But he says, in an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion. And this is, he's quoting this from Roos and Wilson. And this is evolutionists, they have no justification for being able to say what they want, or say what's right and wrong. He says there is truly no ethical justification that how can we say murder or even the Holocaust was wrong. And I thought this was interesting. Richard Dawkins, who's a very notable atheist, he was asked in an interview, if we do not acknowledge some sort of external standard or morality, what is to prevent us from saying that the Muslims, the extremists, the Islamic terrorists aren't right? And Dawkins responds, yes, absolutely fascinating. What's to prevent us from saying Hitler wasn't right? I mean, that is a genuinely difficult question. So this is Richard Dawkins, a self-acclaimed, all-in atheist, and he's acknowledging we really can't say that it was wrong. And if, to be truthful, especially those who, atheists and evolution and so forth, they would actually have to say Hitler was right in what he was trying to do. And that obviously would cause a great deal of backlash. All right, thoughts or comments through that first point that he brings up? Okay. So now he starts talking about God and science. And he addresses the idea, which is kind of a logical fallacy. He says, one might argue you can't prove God by science. Okay? And as Josh points out, we counter that it is impossible for anyone to disprove God by science. Stephen Wall stated to prevent that something doesn't exist, you would have to observe everything everywhere at the same time. In short, you'd have to be God. And that's an excellent point. I mean, how many times have we already seen, just over the last 1,500 years, where scientists have said this and this and this, and then they've had to kind of crawl that back and say, no, we were wrong on that. Or they don't say that. No, our ideas have evolved on that. Or we've changed or how this works, not necessarily going to say, come out and say we were wrong. But even now, even though a lot of it's not really being publicized very much, but the majority of astrophysicists and astrobiologists and so forth are starting to discount the idea of the Big Bang. Because the more that the new telescope that's, not Hubble, the new one that substituted it, the more it's discovering, it's causing a huge panic in the whole astro area because of all the stuff they're finding does not fit with what they expected to find with regard to what they would have expected from a Big Bang. And so there's been a whole lot of articles showing the issues that are coming up and how quietly they're starting to scale back, and they're not using the phrase anymore. Now they're starting to use what do they call it now? It was something ridiculous. It was something beginning, the hypothetical beginning or something like that. It's something silly. And the idea doesn't say anything. Okay, it doesn't mean anything. They just basically, it's another way of saying, okay, we have decided there wasn't a Big Bang, but we don't know what there was. And so they don't really know how to explain it. All right, so he goes on to describe the scientific method. He describes the fact that scientifically, why does it keep cutting me off? There we go. Scientifically, okay, you have to go through things to be able to a hypothesis. You have to test that hypothesis, recreate that hypothesis in terms of experimentation and so forth. And so what he points out is, thus, anything that cannot be repeated in experimental trials cannot be scientifically proven. We cannot prove by scientifically reproducible experimentation that Alexander the Great or the pharaohs or the Caesars actually lived. And I think this is an excellent point. We believe they lived based on what? Based on what's recorded. Okay? And just as we finished talking about with our previous study, how we got the Bible, with all external non-biblical documents, those things are accepted pretty much as fact, unless there's some superseding evidence to suggest that they're not true. Okay, they accept historical historians and what's my word, critical text, I can't think of my term. Anyway, those who examine critical text and so forth, they accept what is written as being true if it's written in a historical way, unless there's some evidence that says it's not. Until they come to biblical text, in which case it's the other way around. But he points out that we believe they live based on other undeniable and discredible evidence, archaeological, historical findings. An interesting thing about that as well is, can you reproduce macroevolution? Now, we'll talk about macro and micro. Microevolution is variation within the species. Okay? We have ladies with blonde hair, we have ladies with red hair, brown hair. Is that a variation within a species? Okay? And some of the women of their own species, right? We have guys with brown hair, blonde hair, variation within the species. Okay? We have black skin, brown skin, white skin, variation within the species. But have you ever observed a human being becoming something new? Or for that matter, reverting back to a different animal? Okay, that's macroevolution. Macroevolution is the idea that one species can then become another species. And you can't even test that. It's not reproducible in any type of way. And so it's just this belief system that people have that's not based on anything other than supposition. So he goes on to describe how that if there is no God, where did the first life come from? And so the evolutionists, and this, they're trying to now, if you've read any of the articles dealing with the quantum mechanics or anything, some of these have sensational headings, scientists figured out where first life came from, okay? And then you actually read the article, and it's full of all this kind of fluff scientific language where you're like, I don't know what we're really talking about. But what the bottom line is, they're trying to explain now that quantum mechanics can actually just generate life, which isn't true. Okay, quantum mechanics, at least based on their observations, can generate particles. But those particles aren't alive. They exist and then they don't. They exist and they don't. They pop in and out of what was observable existence anyway. The point that Josh makes, evolutionary accidents have furnished and finished many, many species in the past, and certainly more will go in the future. The most unlikely accident of all in the history of life on Earth was the origin of life itself. Someone has compared the likelihood of the right chemicals and right forces coming together in primeval soup to the likelihood of a hurricane passing through a junkyard, blowing the pieces together to form a jumbo jet. And in reality, actually, the odds of that is even further than that, but that's a great analogy, is that the likelihood of that happening just exists. And the irony is, this is an evolutionist saying this. So he brings up some evidence for the existence of God. He says, for example, 5 arguments for God's existence. He starts off with first causes, called the cosmological argument. Where did everything come from? It's a self-evident truth that every event or effect has a cause. And then he goes through the logical process. A cause of the effect has a cause, and so on and so forth. But you have to go back down that line and say, okay, where did it begin? Because if every effect has a cause, and every cause was created by effect, then how do you go back to the very beginning of it? And this is where even those who believe in evolution or the Big Bang Theory or some form, now they're trying to redefine it as our universe came into existence because there was a previous universe in existence like 20 billion years ago, and it exploded. It just went boom, and then ours was created. Where did that universe come from? They have no answer for that. And so they're constantly trying to come up with a first cause when scientifically you can't come up with the first cause without there having been something that existed prior to all of it. And that's where Josh goes with this. Eventually, you must conclude that there was a first cause from which all subsequent causes originated. And he quotes from Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Which presupposes that, therefore, God existed prior to everything else. And that's exactly what his point is. That is, everything was created by something except for God. God wasn't created by anything. He has always been There is no first cause when it came to God's existence, which again boggles the mind if you think about it long enough. It starts to hurt. He points out God's name itself, Jehovah or Yahweh. You remember when Moses, he asked God, who should I say is sending me to Israel when they're in captivity? And you remember what God said? I am that I am, I sent you. Okay? That phrase, that the Hebrew there refers to I who exist. I don't depend on anything for anyone's existence. He has always been, and that's the whole idea of Jehovah or Yahweh. It means the existing one. He has always been, he is without beginning, and will always be without end. And this is, again, when you think about eternity, you think about what heaven's going to be like, where there's not going to be any night. Okay? We're ruled by day. We're ruled by systems of this world. There's not going to be any aging. There's not going to be any time in any sense that we think of it. So, what is that going to be like? It's completely outside of my frame of reference. I have no idea. And it really hurts to try to think about what that's going to be like. That's God's existence. So, he brings up, there's only 3 options for the origin of the universe. So within this first point, talking about the kind of the first cause, there's only 3 options for how the universe started. The first 2 contradict known laws of the universe. First one is the universe has always been. Second law of thermodynamics, which basically says increasing entropy, which is basically like you start off with a closed system, but then gradually, through the process of thermodynamics, you lose energy in that system over time. Okay, eventually, you're going to lose the order in which that system has been created. Over time, it's going to degrade. And that's what the idea of increasing entropy is, increasing chaos from order. And that's his point here. If the universe was eternal, it would be a chaotic mess, and not the orderly nature of order. Planets, moons, comets, solar systems, stars we see. Even modern science has conceded that the universe must have had a beginning. Edwin Hubble, which we're familiar with mainly because of the Hubble telescope, he plotted the speed of galaxies and determined they're moving apart from one another and receding from where? Here. From here. And Josh doesn't go into detail on that particular point, but I actually read an article where a scientist was questioned about that. Why did Hubble observe that everything was receding from the Earth? And the scientist laughed and he said, yeah, that's kind of a difficult one for us to deal with because, you know, the obvious explanation is that the Big Bang started where the Earth is. He said, but that's not even possible. Creation couldn't have started with where the Earth is. So we're having to kind of reassess our mathematical formulas and stuff and plot our models to try to figure out why it looks that way. Because the Earth can't possibly be the center of creation. Well, not to say that it has to be, but would it make sense that when God created the universe, he created all things in it, and he created it for man, that he started it with the Earth, and everything else is kind of expanded away from the Earth? Sure. Well, maybe there is a scientific explanation for why it looks that way. But I just think it's interesting that he, out of hand, just dismissed the idea that it's possible creation started here. And you know, obviously the universe and everything did just kind of started spreading out. Talks about the moving apart from one another, receding from the Earth, resulting in the modern theory of expanding the universe. Okay, that's the first theory. Second theory, the universe created itself from nothing. Well, this defeats the first law of thermodynamics. It states that matter can be neither created nor destroyed. It is physically, scientifically, philosophically, and irrationally impossible that something can come from nothing. Now, this is where scientists are trying to kind of put a chink in to talk about quantum mechanics. Now remember, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, nobody understands it. Not no one. And I honestly do believe you're starting to look into a realm that I don't think anybody's ever going to fully understand. That's God's realm. And you know, we might be able to observe things, but I highly doubt we're ever going to be able to harness it. Because then you start talking about trying to create something from nothing. But they're trying to say that quantum mechanics can create something out of nothing, which isn't really true. Those things exist, they just exist outside of our realm of observation. It's not that it's nothing, it's that it exists outside of our ability to see.
It's like the Earth is flat. It was beyond our ability to do
it.
And that's going to be the same thing.
It's going to be the same thing. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's not that something is created out of nothing. It's not that these particles are popping into existence. is that they're briefly being able to be observed, and then they are no longer observed after that. And that's a big difference between saying, well, life could have just spontaneously come into existence because of quantum mechanics. If that's the case, why don't we see life just popping out in the middle of the air all the time? Because that's not how the laws of quantum mechanics works, however they do it. Yes, ma'am?
You can't come from nothing, God could.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And again, and that would go back to laws of quantum mechanics. Okay, quantum mechanics, there are laws that are governing all these different subparticles and so forth. Why? Where did that come from? Because just from an observation, in fact, even scientists today, I mean, Einstein referred to quantum physics as spooky math from a distance, or spooky physics from a distance. Like, he considered it scary. It's spooky. Even Einstein, one of the smartest mathematicians ever, couldn't understand it. All right, the third idea. The universe originated from a first cause. The point that Josh makes is that the only logical conclusion is that the universe was created by a supernatural metaphysical force. Okay? And we're not talking Big Bang, okay? Because the Big Bang, all that material, even in a little tiny bitty ball, had to have come from somewhere. It had to have been formed somehow. So he brings up the fact that for the scientist who has lived by his faith, and I think this is it's really funny if you put it in your mind, you kind of picture it happening. But he says, there's been a lot of scientists who have come to this conclusion as well. There hadn't been a first cause. The scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And just picturing that in your mind, you know, all this struggle, and you finally get to this point, you say, okay, there had to have been a first cause. You get to that point, and everybody's like, hey, welcome to the party. Yeah, we know. We've been there. You know, we've been there all this time. And that's kind of what Josh is pointing out. He mentions how that, is it not unreasonable, this is a quote from Wallace, is it not unreasonable to believe that from nothing came something, and from lifeless matter came living matter? Yeah, that's unreasonable. When would nothing produce something? Can you imagine how out of nothing came lifeless matter, which then somehow produced reason? And that's exactly the process that is being defended, but again, with no scientific basis. All right, so he talks about those three arguments, and again, there's only one that fits within the natural laws of our universe that can be actually defended. Then the second one, so he's talking about the reasons for believing in God and so forth. He talked about first cause, now he's going to talk about design. He says, the scripture attests to God's design in the natural realm through what many call natural revelation. Psalm 19. Okay, David says the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament shows his handiwork. He goes on to describe things in nature. Romans 1, verses 18 through 20. The invisible attributes of God can be clearly seen within creation. There are several different references to the idea and understanding that the things that exist show forth the power of God. And so he talks about the design of the universe. And there's a lot of technical information here, but I think it's awesome because he specifies just how perfect our earth has to be in order to support us. He says the celestial bodies, heavens and bodies, are a testament to great thought, work, and design. The Earth's orbit departs from a straight line only by 1/9 of an inch every 18 miles. If it departed 1/8 of an inch, the sun would incinerate us. If it departed by 1/10 of an inch, we'd freeze. The Earth is 240,000 miles from the moon, 238,900 miles from the moon, but if it was only 1/5 of a mile closer, the moon's gravitational pull would cause the ocean's tides to cover the continents with 35 to 50 feet of water twice a day, which we know as what? Tides. Okay? And if it were any closer, you'd have floods twice a day instead of tides. The moon is receding from the Earth at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters, 1.5 inches per year, showing the moon and the Earth could not be 4.54 billion years old. Now, we finished up on Sunday in our teenage class with how we got the Bible. And so we actually started talking about this lesson. And TJ actually had a good question. He said, so if you did the math on that, and it's 1.5 inches a year, and then you scale that back, assuming it's been 1.5 inches a year since it was created, then how many years would that be? That's a really good question. I don't know. So I did a little bit of math just to think about how far, just kind of give it in perspective. In 10 years, that's 12.5 feet. In 100 years, that's 125 feet. So since Jesus died, 2,000 years ago, since Jesus came and died, the move has only expanded outward by 2,500 feet. To put that into perspective, a mile is 5,280 feet. So it's only gone away, presumably, assuming it's been the same since we've been observing it, half a mile is how far it's gone. And if you kind of scale that back to 2,000 years, 2000 BC, it would have been a mile closer. Okay, again, however, assuming that the flood didn't change things and so forth, that's how far it's gone. I thought that was a really interesting, really thoughtful question. I had to do the math there. If our planet's atmosphere was any thinner, the Earth would be destroyed by meteors. 90% of the world's oxygen comes from oceanic aquatic plants. I had no idea that was the case. I keep hearing about the Amazon rainforests and all the trees and so forth, and you get the impression that, wow, we're not going to have oxygen soon because all the trees are being cut down. Apparently only 10%, and that's not including other plants beyond trees, only 10% of our oxygen comes from those things. 90% comes from oceanic plants. No. Thus, if our oceans were smaller, or if the Earth's thin crust, which contains minerals that are oxidized, and in other words, they store up oxygen, were even 10% thicker, we would run out of free usable oxygen. Everything is just perfect, just right. And did God create creation for him? No, he created it for us. Thoughts or comments to that? All right, he talks about the design of the human body. He mentions how Carl Sagan, he's a well-known evolutionist, very smart individual, but he estimated that the information contained in our DNA in only one of our body's 100 trillion cells is 10 to the 12th bits. One of the kids did the math on that. That's 1 quintillion bits. To put it in a better ability to understand that, one microscopic human cell has more information stored within it than the world's largest library of over 10 million volumes. But where did that information come from? See, again, it had to, for an evolutionist, it got added slowly over billions of years. And yet, we have over 10 million volumes coming, out of the void? Again, that goes back to that idea of design. He talks about hair and how just hair on your body, even ear hair, nose hair, which we consider to be the bane of our existence, has purpose. And it has an important purpose, and I didn't think about that before. I just think it's annoying. He talks about the eye. How Charles Darwin even admitted that it seems absurd to believe that the eye could evolve on its own. And you don't hear that in school and college. Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, didn't believe that the eye could possibly come about because of evolution. To suppose the eye with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, admitting different amounts of lights, for the correction of spherical chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest sense. So Josh gives us a little bit of information about the eye. He says light images enter the eye at approximately 186,000 miles per second through the iris, and is inverted upside down by the lens onto the retina, the back of the eyeball. Then that image is picked up by 137 million nerve endings that send signals to the brain at over 300 miles from that process. It's amazing. All right? The eye can handle 1.5 million messages simultaneously. That's crazy. We think about, well, why can't we have cybernetic eyes? Well, there are cybernetic devices that can help transmit just basic images. This is why. This is why there's never going to be an eyeball that can actually either match or surpass the ability of our eye. And then our brain processes and moves the brain, or the eye, 100,000 times a day. Can you count how many times you move your eye? That's how many times. The noted evolutionist John Pfeiffer even stated that the nervous system is the most elaborate communication system ever devised. And he's a noted evolutionist. He used the word devised. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Josh said, if so, then who devised it? That was a pretty good point. All right, so then the next point he brings up is animal instinct. And he talks about how animals have a natural instinct for things. There's natural knowledge embedded in them that they don't have to learn. And if they did, they couldn't exist anymore. He brings up hens. They know to incubate the eggs by sitting on them for 21 days at a temperature of 105 degrees. They just know that. If they only sat them for 15 days, what would happen? No more chickens. Okay? Or for longer than that. The whole idea here is that they know how to do that. Well, for longer than that, they just hatch. Gray whales, they know to take the same path from the Arctic Ocean through the Bering Straits to the Pacific coast of America, the Baja Peninsula of California, and reach San Diego, California at Christmas. The same path every year. It brings out kind of a gross one, but the kids thought it was great. When hungry young herring gulls somehow know how to peck at a small red spot located on its parent's beak, this action involves a whole series of most complicated chain reactions with a horribly complex underlying nervous mechanism. The end result is an unintentional physiological response by the parent gull to vomit up its food in order to feed the hungry chick. That means that it's not on purpose, but somehow that little chick knows to peck at that exact spot, and it creates this automatic regurgitation so it can be fed. How does it know to do that? Well, God put that in place. When we ask ourselves how any instinctive pattern of behavior arose in the first place and became hereditarily fixed, we're given no answer, according to evolutionists. There's the universal belief argument. Peoples from every culture, society, ever discovered in the history of the world have believed in the existence of a divine creator. In fact, there's some evidence that's now starting to be understood that of the earliest religious beliefs discovered apart from the Bible, some of them may have started as monotheistic and then moved to polytheistic. That's the reverse of what has always been assumed, that it was polytheistic, and this whole monotheistic idea came out of nowhere. Belief in one God, that's crazy. Which would make sense in Romans 1 if, though they knew God, they didn't want to retain God in their knowledge, so they created their own singular God, and then from that evolved more gods. Okay, it would make sense if the earliest civilization started off with one God and then created more later on. And then finally, there's the anthropologic argument, or the moral belief. Okay? Mankind is the only one that has a state of moral, a sense of understood right and wrongs. Even atheists commonly use such descriptors as right versus wrong, good versus bad. We should or shouldn't, we ought not. Well, why do they think that? In such case, the atrocities of Adolf Hitler were justifiable and in line with Nietzsche's doctrine. Paradoxically, atheism itself has a rigid set of what we might call religious convictions, which I think is actually really important to remember, that it's really, in a lot of ways, atheism, humanism is more religion than it is any kind of a scientific belief. It's not. It is, in many ways, blind faith. Okay, people accuse Christians of having blind faith. No, we have a reason why we believe. It's the Bible. They have what they have extracted from facts. They claim they're facts, they're not. Their interpretation of facts that they then suppose had this and this and this and this in the back billions of years ago, which then created this. There's no basis for what they believe. It's their interpretation of those facts. If there is no God, why does any of this matter? The point that he's making there is they're trying to, they teach in schools, they try to force this idea of evolution, and this and this and this. And in many ways, deliberately contrary to the idea of a belief in God. In fact, one of the overriding ideas, that the idea of how civilizations, how humanity goes further and further, the whole idea of religion is considered to be a primitive concept, that in the future, as human beings become more intelligent, we will no longer need religion because we'll know how things work. We won't need a God to explain it all for us. So the paradox to that is, why does that matter? If God doesn't exist, who cares if they believe what you believe? What difference does it make? All right, we'll stop there. We'll finish up with the anthropic principle and the questions as well. Again, I'll have those books. The books are coming in tomorrow, again, according to the tracking information. So I'll have them out on the table Sunday for everybody. But then, at least this way, maybe we can pick up the second half of the chapter, finish chapter 1, and then move on to chapter 2. Thanks, everybody.